Because the current political state of affairs facilitating the refugee crisis in Europe is only made possible by the underlying populations subconsciously relying on the quote-unquote status quo being the oversupply of daily essentials, such as food, clean water, safe environment, affordable housing, etc., etc., what happens when the financial system supporting the status quo collapses? Said perhaps a better way, what happens to these newcomers when the assumption, i.e., the infinite supply of necessities, that Northern European populations base their egalitarian immigration policies on no longer exists, and the domestic population have to compete with the new arrivals for resources if and when they become scarce? That's from Eric.
Well, hello, Eric. How you doing, brother?
Living the dream. I can't complain. Yourself, sir?
Good. How's your level of enthusiasm? I'm still trying to recover from the Chinese water torture drip of the last caller.
It was a really interesting topic, a really interesting conversation. But like my question asserts, he's kind of stuck in the status quo bias. He can't imagine a world without the current set of regulations and affairs, and I don't blame him. That's 99% of society, and at the end of the day, the status quo bias, today was like yesterday, and tomorrow will be like today. That's accurate 99.99999% of the time, but when it's not is when you have these societal changes. It's when you have the collapse of communism. It's when you have the German reunification. It's when you have all these huge world-changing events. And so I'm quite optimistic, actually, for the future.
Good. Yeah, because my general theory is, and my general approach is, if you don't have any hope, shut up.
Yeah, exactly.
Because all you're doing is just dripping on everybody else's momentum. And it's like lead, follow, or get the hell out of the way. We are at a time in history where we need positive energy to break through to a free future. And if it was like, well, but this, we can't do this, and this, and people can't imagine, like, get out the way. If you can't get behind us, get out of the way.
Yeah, no, I hear you. No, but it's interesting because if you remember when the refugee crisis really flared up in Europe, August, September, October of last year, especially here in Germany where I am, you had all these photos of these stupid people at train stations handing out teddy bears to 30-year-old men, and they were affectionately labeled.
You mean the women?
Yeah.
Yeah, the women. The women who voted to keep the Austrian nationalists out of power, as right. I explicitly predicted over a year ago. But
exactly.
Go on.
So these 18, 19-year-old women, or in many cases, mid-40s, desperate housewives, they're handing out teddy bears to 30-year-old men with these refugees welcome signs. But at the end of the day, when they're done with their self-flagellation, they get back in their Porsche and they drive home, and they can go to Aldi and they can buy all the groceries they need. Because they assume that tomorrow will be like today, because today was like yesterday. But when you're thinking about a status quo bias, especially at an intellectual level, there's something that a lot of people don't ever address, and that's the timeline you're looking at. So what I just told you, tomorrow will be like today because today was like yesterday. It's a very short timeline. We're talking about 3 days. But if I was to give you the phrase, this century in Europe will be like last century in Europe, because last century in Europe was like the century before that, you'd say, okay, that's pretty accurate, But in the States, because I'm an American, we have this thing called American exceptionalism. It's this idea that we Americans were the greatest people to ever walk the face of the earth ever, and everyone wants to be just like us.
Oh no, come on.
And so,
I'm gonna school you on American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism isn't, well, we Americans are just so great. American exceptionalism, as far as I understand the term, is because America was the first explicitly philosophically designed country that didn't just arise out of historical momentum and blind tribalism and ancient wars and people running from disease. Like, it was an explicitly designed, constitutionally limited, classical, liberal, enlightenment-based society. That is the exception of America. Everybody says we are the greatest, but the American exceptionalism was the fact that it was designed by geniuses to minimize government. And given that I don't think I'm smarter than the founding fathers, we got to try another experiment next time. But that's my end. It's not just chest-thumping nationalism, because every group has that.
Well, sure. I agree with you that that's how it started off. But when you talk to people, next time you go south of the border, ask some of the local Americans why America is exceptional. They'll say stuff like freedom and God knows what. But, this is my experience when I go home. But in Europe, they have this European exceptionalism, which is, in my opinion, equally as absurd, where you talk to Europeans. When I say Europeans, I'm talking about people in the geographic sense of the word, not the political sense of the word. So people that live on the continent of Europe, if you talk to them, they have this sense of, harketh, we've risen above the past 3 millennia, and we'll never, ever have a war here ever again, and we've attained a new level of humanity. It's just ridiculous because
and what does pride go with before, if I remember my Bible correctly?
Clearly, fall. And so, if you look at the people that are handing out teddy bears at the train station, they're basing this assumption on they can go home and get all the groceries they need. It's safe where they live, and they assume that things are going to keep going like that. But if you look at European history, it's filled with times of scarce resources. I mean, I'm marrying a cute little German girl next month, and she has never known hunger. I have never known hunger. Her parents, who grew up in the former East Germany, they have never known hunger. However, if you go back to her grandparents, they know hunger firsthand, just like my grandparents in the States do. And so this time of abundant resources, it's fairly new for humanity. And for people to assume it's going to last forever without interruption, I think is a bit naive. And so when these people, even though they might be good meaning, and at the end of the day, I mean, you talked about it earlier, intent is completely irrelevant. But even though these people, they might have the best of intentions, their opinions will change when there's not enough, when there's no more groceries at the grocery store. And the people they just welcomed in 2 years before are now, there's 1,000 of them in line waiting for food. And so
what about if your kid needs healthcare?
Well, sure. If you're waiting in line at the hospital.
Food. I mean, it's roads, healthcare, housing, schools, educational resources. I mean, yeah, no, it's madness. It's beyond madness.
And so, it's crazy.
One thing I wanted to mention. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, it's completely nuts. And the only thing that keeps the current lifestyle in Europe going is the current financial system. And I know you've spoken about it many, many times. I work in macro finance here in Frankfurt. The largest banks in the world are my clients. I can tell you that we're on borrowed time. Everyone in the office knows it. It's one of these things that you're not really supposed to talk about, kind of like who the secretary is sleeping with. Everyone knows about it, but you're not supposed to talk about it. And so after you feed, your boss a couple drinks, he'll kind of open up about this stuff. And everyone knows we're on borrowed time. They know we're quarters or years away from another massive financial crisis. And you kind of have to think, okay, well, what is the population here in Europe going to do when the money dries up, when the banking system does fail because it's horribly insolvent, and all these people have just shown up they've grown up in war zones from a completely different culture. And do we honestly think that they're going to wait patiently in line for their daily ration of bread like has happened in Europe for the past few hundred years? No, of course not. It's a ridiculous thing to presuppose. And so, the reason I wrote you is because I would love to hear what your opinion is. Like, when the proverbial shit hits the fan, which you were talking about collapse with your previous caller, I mean, when this does happen, in Europe, they've been traditionally homogenous for thousands of years, and now they're not all of a sudden. How are the domestic populations going to react?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean. I mean, do you mean like all across Europe? How's everyone? I don't know how everyone's going to react, because it depends whether they have the right information or not. It's like when the guy in the woods thinks he's lost, how's he going to react? Well, it depends if he has a compass. Depends if he knows where he could go. Depends if he has a map. Depends if he has GPS, right? I mean, if he gets lost in the woods and he's got a GPS strong phone signal, then he can get back to civilization. If he doesn't, and bees stung him in the eyeballs and he's blind, then he's going to stumble off a cliff. It depends on the information and the technology and the knowledge and the facts and the data that people have. That's going to determine how they react, which is why I'm so interested in getting this information out to people.
Well, sure. Perhaps said a better way. I mean, if you look through European history, whenever you have a huge foreign group of people show up and expect to be able to take resources from Europe, and the European population, the domestic European populations, are expected to share these resources with this new group of people, how has it always ended previously? Every time.
No, it ends in war.
A huge mountains of bodies. And so I feel really bad for a lot of these refugees, immigrants, whatever you'd like to call them, because I think at the end of the day, a lot of these people are coming to their graves. Because at the end of the day, when you do have a Europeans lack the abundant resources which they enjoy right now. The thought process in the minds of everyone is going to change. It's no longer going to be egalitarianism. It's no longer going to be, oh, we have to help these people. It's screw them. I have to pay attention to my family and myself.
Well, but what are they going to do? That most people in Europe, I mean, outside of Switzerland, a few other places, most people in Europe, well, they're so disdainful, you see, of the Second Amendment. How can this barbaric country called America actually allow people to have any guns? What are they going to do? What are they going to do?
Well, I don't think you're going to have like a civil war. I mean, the most common form of mass deportation, mass execution in European history has not been traditional genocide. Genocide is one group of people exterminating another group of people. Traditionally, it's been democide, where a government exterminates its own people. This has always been the largest, has always resulted in the largest European body counts. And so, like you've seen in Austria, and like you see in France with Marine Le Pen, you have these right of center parties. And, you know, a lot of people here, they talk about how, for example, the Alternative für Deutschland, they're a very, very right-wing Rechtsextremos, so right-wing extremism. And it's like, no, like these people are not right-wing extremists. I can show you political parties in Hungary and Ukraine. Those are right-wing extremists. And so if you do have this scenario, which I think is likely, you know, have a financial, not apocalypse, but a depression in Europe, resources become scarce, you're going to have a lot of people voting for more and more and more fringe parties. This has more or less been repeated in Europe over and over and over again. Different groups of people are always the victim, but it always ends the same way. And so when this does eventually happen, the idea is that you'll have people, the domestic populations who are eligible to vote, voting for governments that say, we're going to send all these people home. Now, I mean, imagine you're from the Congo. You've shown up. You now live in Berlin. Your quality of life has gone up exponentially. Someone comes to power and they say, okay, you're going back to the Congo tomorrow. Are you just going to show up to the airport and go, okay, send me home? No.
No, but I mean, I hope it doesn't come to that. But if it does come to that, it all comes down to the media, and it all comes down to the general population. So if there is, because of course refugees, right, and this is my sort of understanding of how this all works. So it may be correct, it may not be. And please, everyone, look it up for yourself. But refugees can get temporary sanctuary in a country, but then they're supposed to go home when the war stops, right?
Sure.
So let's say that there's some way to end the civil war in Syria tomorrow. Well, then the Syrians have to go home.
Sure.
That's as far as, because they're refugees, they're not immigrants.
Sure, absolutely. The problem is,
and so my question then is, okay, so are they going to go back? Well, it depends. And it depends on if the media, you know, portrays these, you know, maybe there's resistance in the no-go zones or in the ghettos or wherever it is, and people don't want to go and they have to be dragged out. And if the media is then playing this with terribly sad music, and anytime there's conflict and there's a drop of blood, they focus on it and everybody's weeping and wailing, well, then it will be sentimentally provoking of enough women and enough cuckish men that be like, oh, we got to stop this. It's so terrible. Mm-hmm. But if people have a different view of it, if the media has a different view of it, and the people have a different view of it, then the willpower to repatriate people back to their homelands will be there.
Sure.
So, absolutely. And again, this just around giving people the facts that they need in order to be able to make better decisions.
Sure, absolutely.
But no, listen, I mean, Europe's been ruled by Muslims before. I mean, Europe has been ruled, I mean, Greece was ruled by the Ottoman Turks for 500 years.
Mm-hmm.
They had to pay the Muslim tax. There was something called the tribute of children. Every Christian community was required to give one son in 5 to be raised as a Muslim and enrolled in the corps of Janissaries, the elite units of the Ottoman army. And sometimes the Greek folklore says that moms would cripple their sons to avoid their abduction.
Crazy. I had no idea.
Europe has been ruled by the Ottomans in the past, and, you know, they'll obviously want to do it again and so on. But my guess is that the benefits are going to dry up.
Mm-hmm.
And if the benefits dry up, what's going to happen? Well, either people will self-deport, as they have done when, look, in America, when there was a financial crash and the construction industry collapsed in '07, '08, there was a lot of self-deportation among Mexicans and so on, right? And there was self-deportation in the 19th century, so to speak, in America, when a third of people who moved to America didn't like it and went back home. And, the migrants came, and if the benefits run out, the migrants may go back, especially if there's more peace in the Middle East. Some will, some won't, right? But and I imagined it's going to be a combination, and some people may make a play for autonomy in a region. They make a play for government power. Who knows, right? I mean,
but we can't tell the future.
No, but if the benefits dry up, then a lot of the refugees will leave. In a free society, like in a non-welfare-based society, moving from, I don't know, someplace in North Africa to Germany, when you don't speak the language, when you don't know the culture, when you have no economic reason, wouldn't happen. Plus, of course, people would be free to not rent to you, which they're not allowed to. I mean, they're forced to rent to people. They're forced to put people up.
Yep.
So, I mean, this would be taken care of in a free society. This is all one big, giant government program. But let me tell you one last thing about this, which I think is really important. I've been thinking about all this all week, so I hope this is not – I don't think I'm shoehorning it in because it is about immigrants. The question is, with regards to politicians, they don't have enough of a tax base, nearly enough of a tax base, to pay for the upcoming giant black hole of retirement benefits, healthcare costs, and so on, right, of this aging population. I mean, you've got countries in Europe with, I think it's Italy, with like a 1.2 per couple fertility rate, like insanely low.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Like Japanese style low.
Germany's actually the worst right now, worse than Japan, worse than Italy.
What is?
Germany. They have the lowest birth rate in the whole Western world.
Right. So this is another reason why you've got these middle-aged women handing out teddy bears. It's because they don't have children.
Yeah.
So they want to mother the migrants.
That's true.
Abdul might not be quite so cuddly as a baby. Women are designed to have babies.
Yeah, no, you're right.
They don't have to, of course, right? But I don't know. In my experience, the women who haven't go a little crazy.
Yeah,
that's just my experience, right? Yeah. And they get wildly sentimental, and then they think that they either go crazy with cats or they, especially if they're not married, right? They just want to mother everything, and they get hysterical, and because they don't have the foundation of a family. Anyway, so if you're a politician and you're facing this demographic winter, and you have nowhere near enough money to pay for this baby boomer retirement nightmare, which of course governments have only known about for about 50 years, so how could they possibly expect to plan for it? Well, what are you going to do? Well, the fantasy, I think, a lot of the fantasy is we'll bring in immigrants and they'll start paying taxes immediately. See, here's the problem. If you're in power, it takes a long time to grow a human being into a taxpayer. We're not the most rapid of crops. We're not like oysters or tadpoles or lizards. It takes us quite a long time to become taxpayers, right? So especially if you go to college, let's say that some politician says, I know, we'll just have people have a lot more babies in our local country and it will be fine. It's like, okay, well, what is that going to do to your budget?
Yeah, the politicians
well, babies are a cost long before they are a benefit.
Yeah.
Because you've got to pay for the mother's maternity leave. You've got to pay for healthcare for the kids. You've got to pay for education for the kids. You've got to pay for college for the kids. I mean, you're in the hole hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars until those kids become taxpayers by the time they reach the ripe old age of a quarter century.
Yeah, no, so
hang on, let me finish. So trying to solve the demographic winter by promoting childbirth is insane. Tragically, it's completely insane. What they're trying to do is bring in people they think can pay taxes quicker. And that's why they're all described as doctors and engineers and all these kinds of great things, right? They're going to bring in all these laborers and all these workers, and they're going to stop paying taxes immediately because some other country paid for their education as children, and now they'll just come over here and they'll be paying all these taxes. And there's no way to solve the demographic winter problem by promoting childbirth, because that buys you a quarter century of significant additional spending before they start paying off in terms of becoming taxpayers. So there's no conceivable way that politicians can promote. Like, they don't have enough money. They don't have enough taxpayers to pay for the old. They sure as shit don't have enough taxpayers to pay for the young as well. So they need to import all of these people they fantasize and imagine are somehow going to start producing taxes immediately, even though it's even worse because they're consuming more resources than I think babies do.
Yep.
And so I think this is one of the fundamental fantasies, that this problem has been left so long that there's no possibility for native births to do anything other at the moment than exacerbate the problem that they face, which is they simply don't have enough money. So I think that the surface argument is something like, well, we'll bring in these taxpayers, and then these taxpayers will contribute money, which we can then use to pay for old age pensions, and we can use to pay for health care for the old, and so on. It's way too late. I mean, they should have done it like a quarter century ago. They should have removed barriers to fertility or paid people to have kids. I don't know what the hell they'd do, right? I mean, they're trying this in Russia now, paying people to have babies, and I don't know, probably trying it in Japan as well. But this idea, so the surface story is we need the taxpayers. I think the more darker and underlying story is, if we can provoke an emergency, people will accept privation. And I've made this argument for years, that when the government runs out of money, it provokes an emergency. Now, usually that's war, but in this case, war is not feasible among the European powers and all nuclear powers and all that, right? So they're provoking this kind of conflict so that people will accept privation, which allows them to not get their pensions and not get their health care, but they'll all pull together because of some emergency. Because the idea that the migrants or the immigrants are going to pay taxes is lunatic, right? So from April 2014 to March 2015, Migration Watch UK calculated that immigrants in the United Kingdom from other European Economic Area countries, right? So these aren't migrants from the third world, right? These aren't economic refugees or war refugees. These are immigrants from other European area countries. Cost £1.2 billion annually, over £3 million a day. So that's bad. They're already a net loss. Immigrants to the United Kingdom from outside the European Economic Area cost $15.6 billion annually, or almost £43 million every single day. That's net.
Yeah.
Their economic contributions. In total, immigration is costing native UK residents nearly £17 billion annually. That's because they contribute $89.7 billion in taxes, but receive $106.7 billion in public spending.
Yep.
And so it's not working the way there's no way for them to work it. The only way for them to work it right now is to collapse the welfare state, cut regulations, simplify the tax code, and say, sorry, taxpayers, you all knew the numbers. You listened to a bunch of assholes who promised you something for nothing, but there's no such thing as a free lunch. This is called actions have consequences. You know how you nag your kids? You don't study for that test, you're going to get an F. Well, if you don't study for reality, reality gives you an F.
Yeah, absolutely. You're completely correct. I agree with what you're saying. A couple things I'd like to kind of caveat there. When you talk about collapsing the welfare state, I agree this is what needs to happen. It has to happen. The problem is collapsing the welfare state would cause politicians to actually lose power, lose influence. This is the exact opposite of what they want to do. And so their incentive is to actually make the state larger because this is what benefits them personally, just human nature.
Oh, of course. Yeah, of course. And of course, they don't want the social unrest that's going to come from that.
Sure, of course not.
Because there will be like unbelievable riots. And I don't think that they actually have the martial force in the country to deal with those riots.
No, they don't. Not in Germany.
There's no good answer here. I mean, this is why we should work as hard as possible to avoid these kinds of situations. Is there are no good answers at the moment?
Well, I mean, this is the thing. For Germany, there is good answers because at the end of the day, like growing up in the States, like the United States has a very high quality of life. I assume it's fairly comparable to Canada, but Germany is the only country I've ever visited, including the United Kingdom, where I can say the quality of life here is higher than in the United States. And so the Germans know how to live. It's not like we're trying to import people to freaking Chechnya. And so
the Germans know how to live?
They have a great quality of life here.
What are you talking about?
It is.
They're taking, like, how many ridiculous numbers of migrants are coming into Germany?
Before this.
Oh, before they had the huge disaster, they were great. Okay.
Yes. Thank you for that caveat. But so the point that I'm trying to make is when you're trying to bring in migrants to pay taxes, if you're trying to support the welfare state, which is an asinine proposition, but let's say they tried it, right? The politicians at the end of the day, I don't think they're stupid. I think they're greedy, but they're not stupid. And so if they're trying to support the welfare state and they're trying to keep themselves in power another decade or two, why in God's name are they bringing millions of people with low IQ that are completely unskilled, and the skills they have don't apply to an industrial Western economy? There are
Well, no. Listen. The reason, sorry to interrupt, I'll be brief, but the reason why they're bringing in the migrants is because the elites have spent the last few generations convincing everyone that the only differences between the races results from white racism. All the races are fundamentally identical. Everyone's exactly the same. And the only discrepancy is the result of racism. Now, having set up that leftist, egalitarian, anti-biological, anti-fact, anti-data, anti-IQ testing, pseudo-imaginary nonsense, having set all that up, how can they say no to migrants? If they say no to migrants, then they have to say why. Now, are they going to say, well, they have cultural values that may not be wildly compatible with the West and so on? Well, then they have to say that Western culture is superior, or at least better for Westerners. They also have to explain why they've let lots of non-Westerners, particularly in Germany, among the Turks, in for many decades without ever mentioning this one basic fact that there may be some level of incompatibility. And then people have to say, well, wait a minute. Do you just not want these people to come in because they're brown or whatever it is, right? And then what are they going to say? Are they going to say, well, the reality is that there are differences between the races and black? Like, they can't say that because they spent this last 50 years covering all those facts up and attacking Charles Murray and Linda Gottfriedson and Helmut Newberg and all these people who've been talking about this stuff. They've set it up perfectly so that they now can't say no. How can they say no?
I agree they can't say no, but at the same time, they are not only not even attempting to bring in other more culturally compatible high IQ individuals into Germany, they're actually actively fighting against it. For example, you have the civil war in Syria going on right now. Horrible, horrible loss of life. I feel so sorry for the people there. However, you also have a civil war going on in Ukraine right now. People are getting shelled in their homes. It's quieter right now, but you still have two sides shooting at each other on a daily basis. And so Ukraine is considered a safe country in Germany. So if you come from Syria, or let's say you come from Pakistan, but you say you're from Syria, and you don't speak any Assyrian, and you come to Germany and say, I'm Syrian, I'm seeking asylum, you get to stay here ad infinitum for free. If you come from Ukraine and say, I'm from Ukraine and I'm fleeing a civil war, the German government will send you home. In the German Constitution, there is something called the right of return, and it invited all Germans from the Soviet Union, now the former Soviet Union, to come back and resettle in Germany. You can get your passport, you can vote, and you can integrate back into society. You have 3 million Germans in Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. They still speak German as their native language at home. You have 3 million Germans in the United States still speak German at home, but they have an American passport. And so the idea is, if the German government couldn't say no to these people, you would think that at least at a minimum, these people would be coming in, and you'd also have a huge flow of Germans coming back in to Germany. And the BBC, they did a great documentary on this, where they went to Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, and they met with all these Germans, and some of them have been there for a few hundred years, but a good majority of them are from, they're the great grandkids of SS officers or God knows what. But anyway, there's a law here that says, if any of your wealth was taken by the spoils of the Second World War, the government will confiscate it. And so the BBC did interviews with all these people and said, we would love to come back to Germany, but my great-great-grandfather, he was there and he came here and he had money and we started the business and it's been in our family for 4 generations. And if we go back to Germany, the government takes it all from us. And so there are basic, simple laws the German government could change, which would encourage high intellectual people, highly educated, wealthy people coming back. Even if they didn't want the Germans from South America, you have the ones from the United States. You have the ones from Ukraine. You have the Volksdeutsche, which are the Germans in Russia.
Yes, but that would be for the German government to say, we want white Germans to come back instead of people from Syria. That we prefer white Germans who speak Germans, who have the same culture, have the same history, who speak German. We want those people to come back. We don't want the migrants to come in as much. In which case you have to say, well, Western culture is better than Middle Eastern culture. Christian culture is better than Arabic culture. But the whole point of the last 50 years has been to take one giant leftist dump on all of Western civilization. They can't reverse course, these people. That's why it had to change, has to come from outside.
Well, this is why I'm saying, and this is kind of why my question is based off of a financial a great financial depression is these kinds of changes that you've been talking about that I try to impart into people here as much as I can. They only come when you have what I talked about earlier, these tail risks. And so the best thing for Germany, the best thing for Europe, the best thing for the United States is this financial collapse. Because as long as people can keep living their lives and they have their television at home and they can watch Kim Kardashian shake her ass, nothing's going to change. You have to get people and put people in a very uncomfortable position, which forces them to really, really reevaluate what's important to them. Is their leftist ideology more important than their children eating or getting medical care? And this is what you have to push to people. Because until it gets to that point, nothing's going to change.
Yeah, no, I get it. I mean, there's an old Dr. Phil episode I watched years ago, and it always sort of stuck with me. And this woman was like smoking and overweight and drinking too much. And she said, "But I'm not sick." And he's like, "Yeah, you're not sick until you're sick." And it's true. It's true. You can do all the crazy shit you want. You're not sick until you're sick. And then you are. So right now, because there's the fantasy of infinite resources, everybody's are selected. There's no in-group preferences. There's no borders. Everyone's the same. It doesn't matter. There are selected, except because of birth control, they're not having kids in an R-selected way, right? They're not having, it's like rabbit sex porn with birth control.
Yeah.
Right? It's like the tiniest condom outside of Japan. So we have this R-selected environment of infinite resources, which means why on earth would you need a nation? Why on earth would you need borders? Why on earth would you need in-group preferences? It's like one tribe of rabbits fighting to drive another tribe of rabbits off the field when there's enough grass for 6 billion rabbits. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, so because of central banking and birth control, we have the worst combination, which is R-selected behavior without R-selected reproduction.
Yep.
Sterility plus promiscuity is the worst combination. It destabilizes the family without creating the next generation. So what happens is there is a certain set of behaviors that are promoted through excessive resources, infinite resources, so to speak, through central banking, borrowing, printing, whatever, right? Mm-hmm. And everyone starts inhabiting those behaviors, and self-restraint looks stupid because there's no winter. You don't need to store nuts for the winter. What are you doing? It's like the ant and the grasshopper, but the grasshopper's just lazing around playing guitar. It was in my kids' book. Grasshopper's just laying around playing guitar, saying to the ant, "Hey, man, why are you storing up all those nuts for the winter? It makes no sense. You got to just have fun. You're too uptight. You got to loosen up." So, as you know, when the excessive resource environment dries up, when winter comes along, everybody's behavior changes. And so we'll go back to the K-selected behavior. We'll go back to people actually investing in their kids. We'll go back to people having kids because, our selected behavior is fine as long as you're having the kids. If you're not having the kids, then our selected behavior is just being a complete asshole to the next generation. Because it's like, well, we want to live like there's infinite resources. The infinite resources that we want require having children. If we're not going to have children, then we're just going to prey off the next generation. The next generation comes along, and the young and the old, who are both drains on society, it's fine. It's natural, right? I'm not doing podcasts while I'm sleeping. I'm dreaming of doing podcasts, right? So the old and the young, they are drains on society, and it requires a big chunk of people in the middle who are all working to provide for them. That's as true in a free society as it is in a statist society. It just generally tends to be a little bit more fair in a free society. But so the K-selected behaviors will come back. And with the K-selected behaviors, there will be limited resources, there'll be in-group preferences, there'll be the reestablishment of borders, and there will be a recognition that the mixing of incompatible belief systems is not something that can be economically well sustained, is the nicest way of putting it as possible. And, the K-switch that occurs very rapidly in the population. I mean, I did a whole novel on German and British families, German and English families from World War I to World War II. And in my research on this, it was just fascinating to see how terrified the British people were of war. In the 1930s, one of the reasons they postponed the war and tried to appease and so on was everyone thought, because there were these giant bombers, that basically the bombers in the 1930s were the equivalent of nuclear war for us today. They thought that would be the end of civilization, the end of everything. It was an unthinkable war. And so they appeased, and everyone's completely terrified of war until they weren't. And then they just went to war, and the K switch had occurred, and off they went to go and do what they felt they had to do. So that switch is going to occur, and it is going to be ugly. And I'm hoping, of course, that it can be resolved as peacefully as humanly possible, which is, of course, I'd love to be wrong. I just don't think I am, right? But so my goal is to make it as peaceful as possible. And because, the longer it's left and the worse it gets, the uglier it's going to be, should it go in that direction at all, which, again, I could be wrong about, but I think that the facts are getting fairly incontrovertible. So, yeah, we'll just go back to case-selected behavior. And if the work that I'm doing and the work that others doing is compelling enough, then people will learn the lessons, and Europe will have its never again, and the West will have its never again moment. And sort of reminds me of Spinal Tap. I don't know if you ever saw that movie. There was this woman in it, dresses like an Australian nightmare. There was this woman in it, and it's a pretty funny film if you haven't seen it.
Yeah, I've never seen it.
Oh man, it's really, really funny. It's about this cheesy rock band. It's like this woman says to them, "Well, we find your cover is sexist. Well, what's wrong with being sexy?" No, sexist. They say, "Well, what's sexist about the cover?" It's like, well, you have a woman oiled, chained on her knees with a giant hairy man's arm stuffing a glove into her mouth. You don't think that's sexist? And the manager says, "Oh, you should have seen what they wanted to put on the album cover. It wasn't a glove, I can assure you." But it's a pretty you got to see. It's a very funny film. It's a classic.
Yeah, it's
great. It's like, yeah, it's great. But in it, there's this. I won't get into any details, but in it, there is this Yoko Ono style figure of this woman who, busts up the band and so on. And at the end of it, the manager comes back and he's looking at her and he's got a cricket bat. He's been going back and forth like, "Don't get out of the line, honey." And hopefully, if disaster does occur, then Europe, after a long period of struggle, will hopefully look back and look at leftism that way. And the lesson will be learned. We always hope to avoid the unpleasantness that teaches harsh lessons, but all you can do is try and convince people, and then if they don't listen and they continue to pursue disaster, sorry, it's popcorn time. The reason I work so hard to try and convince people is that if they don't listen, I don't have to feel bad when disaster strikes them.
Yep. You've absolved your conscience, as have I. So.
Yep. All right. Move on. Do we have another caller, Mike?
Thank you, sir. Cheers. Bye.
Thank you.
We do.
Good luck. Stay safe. And by the way, I don't think America's coming back this time. I don't think it's going to be third time lucky for Europe. But anyway.
Desperate housewives. They're handing out teddy bears to 30-year-old men with these refugees welcome signs. But at the end of the day, when they're done with their self-flagellation, they get back in their Porsche and they drive home, and they can go to Aldi and they can buy all the groceries they need. Because they assume that tomorrow will be like today, because today was like yesterday. But when you're thinking about a status quo bias, especially at an intellectual level, there's something that a lot of people don't ever address, and that's the timeline you're looking at. So what I just told you, tomorrow will be like today because the day was like yesterday. It's a very short timeline. We're talking about 3 days. But if I was to give you the phrase, this century in Europe will be like last century in Europe, because last century in Europe was like the century before that, you'd say, okay, that's pretty accurate, But, in the States, because I'm an American, we have this thing called American exceptionalism. It's this idea that we Americans were the greatest people to ever walk the face of the earth.
Approaches. If you don't have any hope, shut up.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
You know, because all you're doing is just dripping on everybody else's momentum. And it's like lead, follow, or get the hell out of the way. We are at a time in history where we need positive energy to break through to a free future. And if it was like, well, but this, we can't do this, and this, and people can't imagine, like, get out the way. If you can't get behind us, get out of the way.
Yeah, no, I hear you. No, but it's interesting because if you remember when the refugee crisis really flared up in Europe, August, September, October of last year, especially here in Germany where I am, you had all these photos of these stupid people at train stations handing out teddy bears to 30-year-old men, and they were affectionately labeled.
You mean the women?
Yeah.
Yeah, the women. The women who voted to keep the Austrian nationalists out of power, as I explicitly predicted over a year ago. But go on.
Exactly. Like, so these 18, 19-year-old women, or in many cases, mid-40s.
Because the current political state of affairs facilitating the refugee crisis in Europe is only made possible by the underlying populations subconsciously relying on the quote-unquote status quo being the oversupply of daily essentials, such as food, clean water, safe environment, affordable housing, etc., etc. What happens when the financial system supporting the status quo collapses? Said perhaps a better way, what happens to these newcomers when the assumption, i.e., the infinite supply of necessities, that Northern European populations base their egalitarian immigration policies on no longer exists, and the domestic population have to compete with the new arrivals for resources if and when they become scarce? That's from Eric.
Well, hello, Eric. How you doing, brother?
Living the dream. I can't complain. Yourself, sir?
Good. How's your level of enthusiasm? I'm still trying to recover from the Chinese water torture drip of the last caller.
It was a really interesting topic, a really interesting conversation. But like my question asserts, he's kind of stuck in the status quo bias. He can't imagine a world without the current set of regulations and affairs, and I don't blame him. That's 99% of society, and at the end of the day, the status quo bias, today was like yesterday, and tomorrow will be like today. That's accurate 99.99999% of the time, but when it's not is when you have these societal changes. It's when you have the collapse of communism. It's when you have the German reunification. It's when you have all these huge world-changing events. And so I'm quite optimistic, actually, for the future.
Good. Yeah, because my general theory is, and my general...
And everyone wants to be just like us.
Oh, no, come on.
And so,
I'm gonna school you on American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism isn't, well, we Americans are just so great. American exceptionalism, as far as I understand the term, is because America was the first explicitly philosophically designed country that didn't just arise out of historical momentum and blind tribalism and ancient wars and people running from disease. Like, it was an explicitly designed, constitutionally limited, classical, liberal, enlightenment-based society. That is the exception of America. Everybody says we are the greatest, but the American exceptionalism was the fact that it was designed by geniuses to minimize government. And given that I don't think I'm smarter than the founding fathers, we got to try another experiment next time. But that's my end. It's not just chest-thumping nationalism, because every group has that.
Well, sure. I mean,